My name is Brock, and this is the Dungeon Master's Toolkit podcast.
If you'd like to help us make more content, consider joining the Patreon. You can also bookmark our affiliate links to Amazon and DriveThruRPG to support the show with each purchase. Want a free way to help the show? Give it a review on your favorite podcast platform, or like and subscribe to the YouTube channel. Finally, if you'd like to be on the show, or think you know a great guest, contact me on the Discord server or on Twitter. And with that, let's jump into the episode. Welcome, everybody. Today I have Connor Brashar with me today. Welcome, Connor.
Thank you, Brock. It's good to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yes, glad to have you. Why don't you start out by telling us how you got started in tabletop role-playing games?
Yeah, so I went to a little tech school in a very small town for my undergrad, and when I went to college, there were two things you could do on a Friday night. You could either play D&D or you could go drinking, and I chose the former most of the time. So I started playing it in college. I've been playing for about 12 years now, about every Friday night, maybe 90% of the time. We've been pretty successful with that. I've got a pretty good, consistent group. We've played a variety of games, but mostly D&D in some form or another for that whole time.
And what edition did you start with?
We started with 3.5. Back then, 5e wasn't out. We did switch to 5e a couple years into that, and then switched to my game, Sacadia, about a year and a half ago, and we're testing that out still in beta.
Yes, and I do want to talk to you about that. Do you want to give like the elevator pitch for your game?
Yeah, happily. So, Tales of Sacadia is a legacy tabletop role-playing game set in a world of ancient myths and legends. So, it's built around a civilization of antiquity. Players and the GM work together to build like a small town into a major empire and then destroy it. And along the way, in different campaigns that people will play over the course of several years, players take on the role of major people in major events in this civilization and play through the challenges and sort of glory and destruction of that empire. So players and GM collaborate together to create the culture, and that changes the way that the game itself works throughout.
What inspired you to branch off and to write your whole own tabletop system?
I would say it sort of was an accident. Originally I had been writing books, very bad science fiction novels for a long time, along the way of playing D&D, and it just took so much time to prep for GMing when it was my turn to GM for our group that I thought, well, I'll try to write a setting that I really enjoy, and the setting that I wanted to play in it's more based on ancient myths and legend or ancient, stories of antiquity, things like Roman Empire type stuff, rather than the sort of like traditional fantasy, elves and dwarves and dragons type stuff. And I think as I slowly started building this, it just sort of grew rather organically. And then somewhere along the way, I realized that I was making a whole tabletop role-playing game, and that was going to involve a lot of design work that I didn't know how to do. And so then I had to start building out and trying to figure out what was it that I really wanted to see in a game that I wasn't getting out of D&D. And I think that sort of informed a lot of the decisions that I made along the way for Sacadia that informed the type of game it is. So, for example, the legacy nature of play, where different campaigns sort of build on one another as you play. That was something that didn't have you could do it in D&D, but it didn't have codified rules, and that's what I really wanted was a way to really formalize how you could grow something as a group between campaigns and how, your stories that you would tell from one character might be the stories told in the next and how that really influences what you're doing. Um, I think that was one of the major tacks that I wanted to take for Sacadia that really led me to work through it as a tabletop role-playing game.
And by legacy, I assume you mean kind of in the same way that some board games are legacy, where one playthrough to the next may have impacts on each other.
Correct. Yeah. So in like a traditional legacy board game like Legacy Risk, right? You're playing Risk, but you put, you have like a research tree, right? And you're researching new technologies and you put stickers on the board that change it as you play. Very much in the same way, Tales of Sacadia is meant to have sort of this growing influence in culture. So as you play, the game, you grow this culture together, and there are rules for how you build like a town and build like a city out of that town or throughout the ages. There are rules for how you grow a culture and how that culture then impacts the game loops within the game itself. And so really trying to make sure that along the way, when players build something, they're creating cultural decisions that are going to change what they have and experience in like the traditional like exploration game loop or conquest game loop or whatever particular type of game they want to play.
I think it's really neat to have um, rules around the world building as well, because I think that's a place in most role playing games that there's not necessarily a lot of information, or it's here's the world and then you can make something else up if you want to, but there's not necessarily like mechanics or specific procedures for how you handle the world building.
Yeah, there's one game in particular I'm a big fan of that I think does this really well. It's called Microscope, and Microscope's a pretty famous collaborative world building tabletop role playing game. And I was pretty inspired by that in terms of the actual like rule design for the process. I knew sort of in a big way what I wanted. Microscope sort of gave me the confidence to feel like we could pursue it as a team, I think, because collaborative world building has a lot of implications for the GM and for the player when you're playing. And as a GM, it can be hard to give up the agency in doing the actual world building because that's going to implicate changes to the plot and the way that players are engaging, how they're going to engage the story. And so making sure that there's a sort of scoped out rule was important. And then making sure, furthermore, after that, that when all the players are coming together and creating a world, they're creating a world that everybody in there wants to enjoy. And so it's fun to work through. I think it's been a real draw for the game for the folks that we have had playing it. I think there's been a lot of interest in building a weird, unique culture and then seeing what you can do with that in this larger setting. So we had like a team of players that got together and built, like a civilization that rode giant like arthropods, like giant crabs, and they rode that into battle, and they built like this army and stormed off the mountains into this seaside town with their army of crabs and had this really unique cultural interchange with a culture that I'd already created that existed in the world with their own culture as they sort of stormed down. And it was really informed by the decisions that they'd made as players in a way that I hadn't seen in games before. And I think things like that are the sort of goal that we're looking to hit. And Microscope was a real inspiration for that.
And do you have specific points in the book where you talk about how like different cultures may interact with each other, or to kind of help facilitate that for the GM?
Yeah, so the main thing we have that sort of drives the culture in Sacadia is something called the cultural tapestry. And so as players build their culture, there are 13 pillars of civilization. So things like architecture, food, things like virtues that sort of drive what that civilization is or how it's represented. And as players build into this cultural tapestry, they come up with ideas for how to drive that. And they're informed by the plot, they inform the plot, and then they can change things in the future. So, for example, if a GM is trying to tell a story at the beginning of the game, they may have a list of questions that players have to respond to for how that cultural tapestry works. And that will inform plot points in the future in the game. So I can give a great example of that we had for my main game when we first started the game. I told players to tell me how they handled funerals. So when somebody dies in their culture, how do they want to handle respecting the dead and taking care of their body? And when they originally came up with it, they came up with a deviated requirement for bodies that were royalty and were not. And for royalty, there had a requirement that the body had to be brought out to the deep sea and dumped into the deep ocean, and the family had to be around for like a silent vigil for like a week, which is a really fun idea when you're only talking about a cultural tapestry and not thinking about like the plot that you're going to be playing later. And so right now in my game, and potentially by the time this episode's out, they'll have finished their leader has just died, and they've just died deep into an enemy city And they have to now go in and get that body, make sure that they can get it all the way back out to the ocean and have that silent vigil in the middle of a war with another civilization. And so something like that is something that, it's really exciting when you're doing the civilization cultural tapestry building. You don't think about how it's going to impact your gameplay until it does. And it just creates those hooks that we found really fun.
Yeah, and those things are gonna pop up and be like, oh, do you remember this is how we handle this thing here? So now it's different from our own world, but then also, um, like you said, it's gonna inform things that happen in the campaign in interesting and probably unexpected ways.
Yeah, I have machinations for this game in the GM guide to be adding some notes in about how there's a concept in the cultural tapestry of complexity. So as the whole overarching game loop is built around you start by settling a civilization. It's a small town. You do the town building exercise as a team. You can do little exploration games, and eventually you're going to lead to conquering. And so your civilization begins conquering. You play through a series of campaigns that are sort of like a war game themed, where the game loop isn't necessarily exploration and dungeons, it's large scale battles. Then you get to this large scale empire that you're exploring. You might have, you might do a trade game where you're trying to, game the economy through trade, and go from point to point throughout this big empire you've built. And then finally, through a game loop called Intrigue, players destroy their civilization for personal gain. And so the concept that I'm working on right now, we have the original game loop constructed. We're in beta, and we've got people playing the game and doing the exploration game loop, the town building loop. We've got crafting and all the basic classes and everything in there. But the goal overall is to build up this series of civilization markers that sort of measure the quality or the progress of that civilization to empire. And so that when we get to the intrigue game, you're literally spending these points that you've accrued through years of play for a personal glory and a personal moment. And so it's important to us to make sure that we have that sort of in place. It's a big focus right now in the game, and that'll sort of allow that sort of interconnection there where when we build up things in the cultural tapestry, it gets too complex. We can no longer change the cultural tapestry. And if we try to change the cultural tapestry to remove a problem we've created early on in the game, we can no longer do that. And so that sort of informs the friction points for plots in the future is you've added these elements to the cultural tapestry that were really exciting when you created them. And now you have to handle the decisions that you made because you can't change them anymore. And so that complexity focus gives us the ability to sort of set ourselves on a path to the destruction of the civilization once we've built something we really like.
So I'm curious, just listening to you talk about, creating a culture and also, starting at a fledgling tribe to becoming a full-on empire. It seems like a lot of the kind of world building stuff that you have could work on top of just about any system, right?
Yeah, actually, the town building system I made long before I made a tabletop role playing game for D&D games. We built a little system so you could build a small town for small town horror games. And so the idea was I built out all these rules for people got supply, and they spent it on buildings that they could put in the town that made it more religious or gave it markets or the they could pay for ththese things. We played through a couple of different ages, and throughout the different ages we'd give people I'd give people these narrative loops that happen, and they basically just a very meta level make decisions for the town that are going to inform the future plot we would play in the small town horror. And throughout the process, I gave everyone manila envelopes, and the manila envelopes had their role. You're the priest, your job is to encourage religious growth in the city. You're farmers, you want to encourage agricultural growth in the city, things like that. So they all had these sort of goals in the town building exercise. But I gave one person a secret, and that secret was the sort of destructive plot point that was going to be the small town horror. So they were a cursed noble line that or for example that has when the noble spirits die, they don't actually die, they become ghosts that haunt the town, and the nobles are trying to hold them back by creating this protected crypt and slowly recoiling away from everybody else. None of the players knew that that was happening, or knew, but they could see that the nobles were slowly recoiling through this narrative arc. So then when we started the small town horror game, players all felt this ownership over the town itself because they'd built it, I hadn't built it, and handed it to them. So they really felt like they cared about what they were experiencing. So when like the inn burns down in the small town horror game, it's not my inn as the GM, it's their inn as the players, and they care about it in the same way that their characters would. And so we built that first, and I think that was a big part of why I wanted to build this sort of tabletop role-playing game approach where players are participating in building the culture because their construction in it, their interpretation of it really changes their feeling of ownership of it and makes them care a lot more about everything that's happening to it.
Yeah, that's something. So that whole player investment and player channeling player creativity, I guess, is something that I've been trying to incorporate more and more into the stuff that I'm doing, because I do find that same thing that you're getting is they care about it more when, like you said, it wasn't just handed to them as here's the thing that you should care about. It's so this is the thing that we built or that we came up with. So we do care about it.
Yeah, and I think in part too, especially for like a legacy game, players love callbacks, right? I mean, if you have a small town that almost burns down, a small town horror, and then a future game shows up in that town, and there's a statue of the old party, fighting this great evil. Everybody loves that, and so I feel like seeing the layers of how previous games can build on others is something you can incorporate into any type of game and really makes people care about what they're experiencing. It makes people a lot more invested, I've found. There is maybe a trick to that, which is that sometimes players are really silly. And as a GM, I feel like sometimes you want to build like this really serious setting, and then players come in and they're joking around. And I think there's this fear that GMs often have about letting go of that agency because their players can be kind of silly. And they're not, thinking of the larger game, and I think GMs are kind of guilty of that too sometimes. But I think that agency needs to be shared to make players care the most about these settings.
So I want to talk back a little bit about so the different loops that you have or that you're working on setting up. So you have um these, like, trying to figure out what I'm trying to ask. How long would it take, or are you kind of expecting it would take for somebody or a group to sit down and kind of go from the start of this game and then through, a campaign, essentially kind of get to the end where the empire is crumbling? Like, what does that time
Yeah.
investment look like?
So I'll preface this with when I first started making this game, I thought nobody's going to want to play this except me. And I thought that because that game loop on the whole takes a minimum of 7 campaigns. And so in my mind, on average, playing through the full game loop would take about a decade of playing 4 hours a week every week. And so one of the important things in constructing this game was making sure that players could come and go, right? You don't want players to have to commit to a decade of play. That's not something that's reasonable to ask. And so for the way that Sacadia has been constructed, you can drop in and out. You can show up, you can play a game, you can leave. You don't have to keep playing Sacadia. You don't have to do this full game loop if you don't want. And you can show up, you can play the first game loop. You can decide, I like the town building, I like the cultural tapestry, I want to build my own culture, but I want to build that culture for D&D, for Pathfinder, for whatever. And I think you can definitely pull those pieces out. But for me, I think being able to play through that full loop was something really exciting, and I have at least vague confidence that my party's at least interested in playing through a full 10-year game loop here. So yeah, it takes a lot of time to do everything. So it was a really important design consideration for me to make sure that you didn't have to.
Yeah, that makes sense because, like you said, that's quite the time commitment. So I'm assuming you're committing one campaign per age.
Yeah, so the game is built around 7 ages, and there are 4 game loops for those 7 ages right now. There may be more someday. But the planned game loops that I have are exploration, which is sort of the most traditional game loop that players are familiar with. That's you're exploring, you're encountering interesting areas. Your dungeons or dungeons, they're ruins you find in a lot of cases, or wilderness dungeons. There are conquest, which is built for like wartime events where players are part of like a large scale army and rising through the ranks through like a war. There's a trade aspect that I'm working on, which is players are part of an imperial economy and they're trying to game trade. And then there's intrigue where they destroy it. And those four aspects, I call them, but they're game loops. They're ways you could engage the game. Are all built to work with every combination of classes and races, so you can plug and play those game loops. And they're all meant to sort of be chosen for whatever part of the era you're in. And so there's 7 eras of empire that we work with are the settling of the town foundation, where you're building out that town, conquering to create an empire, your large scale empire, the decline of governance brought upon by like imperial flaws that you've introduced early, the fall and collapse of that ruin, and then the final ruin. And so those are the 7 game loops, 7 games that I envision being the bare minimum there. So settlement, foundation, conquest, empire, decline, fall, and ruin. One thing that I was particularly interested in here with these eras of empire is this is sort of it's a game in antiquity. So historically, it's set before the medieval era, right? So it's when I was creating this, it was sort of meant to be the myth or the legend that leads to a fantasy setting. And what that means is there's a lot of little hints in the world building for the setting. There's a lot of little hints in the way that monsters exist, where as players play through these games, they are creating a like high fantasy magic setting that would work with something like Pathfinder or D&D. And players build out like the origin civilizations that will lead to the sort of feudal medieval process. And so when you play through that final game, Ruin, you're really exploring ruins of your old civilization in search of treasure in like this now high fantasy setting that is full of like arcane and divine energies and dragons that you can use for like a more traditional fantasy game.
Yeah, I could just see playing through these ages just as an exercise in world building and creating your own play space, essentially.
Yeah, and I think I'm really excited about that. One of the things that we have in the game is a craft system. At the beginning of creating these areas of Empire, there's no magic items, right? You don't have a lot of magic items. You got these rare ingredients you can find in the world, but you can't go to like a magic shop and buy the magic items you need. You have to build them. And what we do is we keep track of these magic items, and players can inherit them across games through these inheritance rules that we've created for that legacy play game loop. But beyond that, I'm keeping this big list of them. And so when we get to the like high fantasy medieval era, you'll be able to go to that magic shop and you'll be able to buy those magic items, but they won't be the like the magic items from like the books that you can buy in D&D. It'll be the list of all the magic items they've ever built, and some of them are just dumb and like fun silly little things that are kind of weird and interesting. Some of them are really powerful magic artifacts. They really fit into that like weird high fantasy magic item setting, and that sort of makes it, I think, a fun part of that origin.
Crafting and stuff has always interest me, as well as allowing characters to kind of dictate what kind of things they want to make. Do you want to expand a little bit on like the crafting system and stuff that you have in here?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. I'll preface this. I also think it would work for something like a different game. Though the numbers would obviously have to change. The crafting rules for Sacadia are really built around this series of checks. So you find these magic items throughout the world. You can buy them at markets. You can pillage them in war. You can find them in the natural world. And you sort of gather as you engage in these other game loops, you gather these ingredients and you have these skills or talents that you have that allow you to craft. And you sit down and you make a roll for incorporating these individual craft ingredients. And it's sort of an interactive process between the GM and the player. The player decides the type of thing they want to have based on the ingredients they have and the crafting skills they have. And they sort of work with the GM to define what they want that magic item to do. So if you had like a blacksmith and they want to make a magic sword and they have, they may have iron, but they may have like a magic ruby. And that magic ruby might have a magic property, and that magic property might be something really weird. It could be space, it could be fire, it could be um, leaves for all we know. And so let's say they won't have like a fire ruby and they want to incorporate it. This is a real simple example, but you can create this magic item with which is a flaming sword, and the craft ingredient rarity determines how powerful it is. And so you can sort of build up these magic items that you can then use later. And they're fun, but there's sort of an interaction between the GM and the player. And it was originally designed because, I'm talking about creating a game I'd like for people to feel comfortable or empowered to play for a long time. And so the classes were all built around having long-term play. And so you ideally could play the same class 3 or 4 times and not get bored because you'd have different options. So you could sort of build the class differently every time. But some of the class ideas that players started having didn't really jive with what I'd originally intended when I'd created the class. And so they were always missing like 1 or 2 abilities that would just make this build work perfectly. And so creating a magic item that like makes that build work was really satisfying for players, where they could start building their own class in a sense by creating this magic item that sort of just tips them over into a functional build that makes something all the more interesting for them. And it's been pretty successful. We like it. It's I'd say a little bit of GM work up front, but it's been really successful for our party.
And speaking of like characters and classes, how do the characters do they transition between the campaigns, or when you start a new campaign, are you starting brand new characters?
Yeah, that's a great question. So most of the ancestries in Sacadia are not long-lived. They're kind of like human length, and so most players would play a character for one game and then retire them for the next game. And so our first game is coming near an end now, and I've started asking players what they want for the future of their characters. So if they want them to, how they want them to die, what they want them to do after the campaign ends. Um, some of them are not immortal, but long-lived, so might live for hundreds of years after the end of the game. And I think one of the interesting things with legacy gameplay that we're trying to explore is, what does that mean for your ability to play a character for a repeat game, right? Could you play the same character in another game provided it starts at the right level? How would you be able to play these characters in subsequent games or interact with them? So that's something we're considering. I think for the most part, players will play different characters in each campaign. But I certainly don't think players couldn't play the same character in multiple games if they play a race that is particularly long-lived.
You mentioned there's the potential that they could play a character multiple times, but provided that the levels and stuff matched up. So I'm assuming if you start as like a level 1 character, the power level between that character and say a higher level character may be much different.
Yeah, definitely. One thing that was sort of interesting playing like a traditional tabletop role-playing game, and I'll say traditional to mean D&D and Pathfinder. When I've played those games before, those games are really built to maximize player agency, right? So the players are built to um, have whatever tools at their disposal to do what they want, and the GM is meant to work with that. For Sacadia, I was really trying to build a game that maximized GM agency. So the intent of the whole game is to make sure that the GM feels empowered to take that story torch forward for that empire in the best way they can. And they're working with the players to make that happen. All the players are a big part of that in the world creation, the culture, and in their own characters. But making sure that the GM had the tools to tell the kind of story they want was very important to me. And the reason I go on that long diatribe is because, in relation to your question, is that in D&D, you're a hero, right? You're playing as a heroic character from level 1, you're a weak hero, but you're still a hero. And if you're playing a level 20 character in D&D, you're near mythic power, but you're a hero. Um, in Sacadia, I really wanted to make sure that there were stories that you could tell at all levels of civilization, if you're the GM. And so we have sort of 3 different level ranges for different types of stories. So levels 1 to, I would say 3 or 4, is really you're like a normal person. So if you went to like fight a normal NPC on the street, or like the merchant selling dates on the street corner, they are somewhere between level 1 and 4 most of the time. Levels 5 to like 12 probably are like that hero range where you are like a reasonable heroic power threshold. You could see people in the world being like that. But they're like, high-powered generals, Hannibal, Caesar, things like that. Players are taking on the role of a hero very much in the traditional sense. And then levels 13 through 15, which is the max level for Sacadia, is sort of like the demigod zone. So in this area, you're something like your Heracles or your Odysseus. You are a mythical hero of legend, and you're going to go fight the Hydra. You're not going to fight merchant guards, right? And so that level design is really built around players being able to, or GMs being able to pick, this is the type of story I want to tell. It fits level 1 to 5. Players going to feel like a hero at the end of it, but most of the time they're going to feel like a normal person, or they're going to feel like a godly ordained hero right from the start and the whole time. And so there's actually a pretty steep power ramp per level as a result of that.
Sure. So yeah, having players being different level from each other would cause maybe some conflict at the not necessarily at the table, but just it would just feel weird because you're not in like the same power zone as somebody else.
Yeah, yeah. So players are definitely meant to be around the same level most of the time. We do, like checkpoint gated leveling in a sense, where you've gotten through this challenge and now you're all going to level rather than have an experience or anything like that. Um, one of the things I used to try to do playing D&D was have people go up against like a horror game, and I wanted them to feel like a normal person. And nobody liked that. And nobody liked that, I think, because they they're playing a game where they're told they're going to be a hero, right? I mean, everything in D&D is telling you you're a hero. And so having a game where sometimes you're not the hero and sometimes you're really the hero was a nice way to be able to like balance that and say, you can tip that you can tip that needle sort of between myth and legend versus, people really on the edge of horror, and you can sort of explore all of that. Um, I, uh, I think that was probably a big reaction to, excuse me, to my interest in telling different types of stories that I couldn't with the tabletop role playing games I was playing.
And then I have the PDF open, so I'm kind of like skimming through this as we're chatting.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk about? I see that you have like character aspects and kind of what goes into putting a character together.
Yeah. So the whole idea here was for everything to be modular. And so I think there's a if you hear about D&D 5e, one of the biggest complaints among classes people had was the ranger, the baseline ranger, right? Everybody hated the ranger because uh it was built for exploration. And because D&D claimed they had 3 things happening at once for D&D 5e. They had like the exploration loop, the skills, and then combat. And they were all connected. Everything sort of bled together in the class design. And so the Ranger was built for exploration, and they were really good at it. But nobody used the exploration rules that D&D provided, and so the Ranger ended up feeling really weak. You didn't roll for a lot of that stuff, but that's what they were built to roll for. And so in order to have a game that was meant to last like 10 years, I really wanted to separate all this out so that you could just plug and play the parts of the game you liked. Um, and so we have professions, which are sort of the classes that people explore. And those professions you plug in when you want to play combat. If you want to do combat, you need a profession. We built out talents, so talent aspect tree, and that talent aspect you plug in if you want to have skills. So almost all the time you're going to have a talent aspect at least. We have ancestries, and the ancestry, you also normally plug in. The ancestry isn't like a full up aspect. It was made to be very simple to design so that people could like make their own very easily. So there's a series of baseline ancestries in the game where you can pick one and you can start playing it right away. But it's really easy to build your own if you want to try something different. And then we have the party aspect, which is that larger method of exploring the game. So exploration, conquest, trade, and intrigue. Exploration is the only one of those that's finished right now. But the goal of that is you plug that in, and everybody in the party is taking is building that aspect together. So every time you level, the party gets together and talks about, for exploration, for example, what are we going to upgrade in the way that we are exploring the world? Whether we're buying new mounts, whether we're upgrading our ship, or gaining the ability to explore like rare mystical biomes that we otherwise couldn't enter. And by building that all together, players are engaging the game. So you can play a game with only a race and a talent if you want, and you would just be, like not a non-combat oriented game where you're exploring the world and enjoying it, but not participating in combat. You can plug in that combat and start playing it and engaging it in a bigger way. And that was, I felt, a decision mainly made to simplify the complexity and how these things work. Now they're all separated. I don't have to worry when I change something in combat about how it's going to affect the skills players have and vice versa.
Sure, that makes sense. And what kind of like role mechanics and stuff do you have for resolving things that are happening in the game?
Yeah, so it's a D20 system. It may be somewhat familiar to the way players are used to playing many other traditional tabletop role-playing games. One of the main things that we have in Sacadia is conditions. And when I first started making this game, I did not anticipate how big of a component of the game these were going to be. But conditions are sort of like stackable leveling effects. So you can have like 3 levels of a condition like nausea, and it will slowly degrade over time. But the impact to it is profound as a function of whatever that level is. As players are playing, they interact with the system in combat. You can impose several levels of a condition to a character, and then you can't give them more of that condition. You can't continue to stack it further. So you sort of build in these things where you're trying to really set up a combat in a way where the whole party can work together in order to meet a goal. And these conditions really participate in that ability to do so. So you can give a character, an enemy, for example, 3 levels of pin. They cannot use either their arms or their leg. The end of their turn, they're going to get one of their arms back. The end of their next turn, they're going to get their other arm back. And then the final turn, they're going to gain the access of their arms again. So in that time, you've locked down this guy and his arms. And now you have to figure out how to respond to that enemy as a group while that condition's degrading. So that was one interesting thing that I felt like people have really gravitated towards. We have stacking advantage in this game. So instead of having like 1x advantage and that's it, you can just mix and match as much as you want. So players can really ramp up advantage to like 3 or 4 times. There's a couple classes built around gaming that. There's a crit fishing build, for example, that stacks like 4 or 5 levels of advantage and then just goes nuts trying to get a nat 20. And I think all of these things sort of work together to make the game a little bit different. Classes don't all do the same thing. I would say hesitantly, from my own experience in the games that we've been playing with this for the beta test, not everybody likes every class. They're not built to do the same thing. When I've played a lot of tabletop games before, I've been interested in trying every class, and I don't like them all either. But in this, I think it's really pronounced that like different types of players might be interested in different types of classes, and really take to some of these. And that's just a function of the fact that they really engage the game differently. With respect to these conditions and advantage, and the complexity can change drastically from class to class as well. So some players, don't like they're there to hang out, right? They want to play the game, but they want to push a button when it's their turn and then go back to watching. And that's a really reasonable play style. Some people want to do that. You want to enable that. And so there are classes built for that, and some classes are really not built for that. Yeah.
And how long have you been working on this? Because I mean, looking at this PDF, you have written a lot of stuff.
I've been working on it for about 3 years, maybe 15 to 20 hours a week for the whole time, which has been rough because I definitely have a full-time job, and so it's been a lot of time and effort put into it, and we're currently, like I said, we're in an open beta right now. We are trying to get new players if anybody's interested, and I think that's really where we're at right now, where we've really ran down a lot of the debug output that I think my group of players and the friends that I've dragged in to helping to test this game have been reasonably able to produce. And now I just need that last bit of debug information, the last 10% that takes 90% of the energy that really requires, I think, a lot of people invested in trying it out. But it's on paper, it's balanced now. I hosted a large tournament where we invited a whole bunch of people in, and they all built their teams, and they all fought these complicated fights in like a coliseum. And I was really expecting people to break it, and very few teams actually broke the game. Some teams told me it was really hard to break, which surprised me a lot. I suspect they're wrong. And that future people will find new ways to break it. So I don't think my work is done, but it's been a lot of fun, and I've really enjoyed making it. So I'm looking forward to continuing. And I've still got more game loops to make, right? Oh, exploration is the only game loop that's finished. I still have to make conquest and intrigue and trade to make sure that players can engage the game differently. And I plan on adding new classes and races as well.
What kind of are the future plans that you have for the game? I know right now the PDF is available for free on your website.
Correct. It's available for free on the website and on our Discord. I think that the Discord's the largest community we have for it right now, so that's the easiest way to engage and find players too. We've got a couple of players in there looking for a game. But yeah, so the website and the Discord are the easiest ways to get it. I don't have any near-term plans of making this game cost money. My main goal is to get people playing it and really build that community. I'm hoping to sometime next year, probably, do a Kickstarter for the game. So probably 2024, I'll run an actual Kickstarter, and try to build some hard copies of the game. But I want to get through this open beta first, and I think this open beta will be it's just a lot of pulling people in and trying to get them interested in checking out the game and seeing what they break and trying to fix that. So that's going to take some time, but once we're done with that, I'll kickstart the game, and then my plan is to just start making more players' handbooks and modules. So plan on having at least one module for every one of those ages, so 7 modules, and then at least one player's handbook for every party aspect. So one for exploration, which is this first player's handbook, and then one for trade, intrigue, and conquest. And each of those will come with 2 new classes, and I know what they are. It takes a lot of time to balance those classes once I build them.
That's a lot of writing that you have ahead of you, it sounds like.
Yeah. When I started doing this, I really thought this was going to take this quick 20-minute adventure in and out. I did not think this was going to be a very complicated build process. And if anybody listening to this has designed their own tabletop role-playing games, you will know how foolish that was of me. To not even think about it. And now that I'm in it, I really love it. I've really enjoyed this process. And I'm learning so much, but it's been it really started out as a response to, my frustrations with the game, the tabletop role-playing game I was playing at the time. I was playing a lot of 5e and was tired of how similar everything felt and how challenging it was to use legacy style play I wanted to do. I think I really started this without thinking about it, and I really love it. But yeah, I've got a long road ahead of me still, I think, to make this everything I want it to be. It's eminently playable, we think now. People seem to really enjoy it, but it's definitely got a road to go.
Well, we're getting close to the end of the interview portion of this. So, are there any things about the game that you want to talk about, or about game mastering in general, tips or anything you'd like to leave our listeners?
Oh, I think there's a lot of different kinds of GMs, and I'm a very world building heavy GM, if you couldn't tell. I think I don't know that that's always the best kind of GM. I think there's a lot of different types. Some people are very experimental. Some people are playing just to enable the characters and the players. Some people like, that really story focused approach. And I really want to make sure that what I'm building here are tools that people can use for whatever they're trying to do. But there's a lot of really wonderful tools out there, and so I think one thing I thought when I first started doing this, I'd played some games, but I'd really overwhelmingly played like the big guys, right? D&D and Pathfinder. And I have been really impressed as I've been looking at this. People who find out I'm building the game have sent me things like Microscope. I didn't know about until after I was trying to build the cultural tapestry. And people sent me Microscope, and I was just astounded. It was phenomenal. So it's a very good time to check out new systems and try new things. And I think um, players should be doing it more. I think I didn't do it for too long, and I think it's made a big difference to even just the way that I'd play, a traditional game like D&D again. It's really changed the way I looked at that. And so I'd say my big advice would be to try out different systems and see what you like and what you don't. Even if you don't play the game, you're going to pull something from it and take it back with you. And I think that's been really empowering for me.
That seems to be one of the pieces of advice that comes back around a lot on the interviews, is to try more systems and just see what else is out there. So there's a lot of fun stuff that you can steal and plug and play into whatever you are playing.
Yeah, definitely.
Well, Connor, this has been a ton of fun. Do you want to go ahead and plug where we can find you and your game online?
Yeah, you can find Sacadia for free at talesofsacadia.com. That's Sacadia. So talesofsacadia.com. And we've got the Player's Handbook, the GM Guide, a small 4 to 6 session adventure, and hopefully by the time this comes out, one shot or two. I'm working on those right now. And so they're all free. They're free to play. Please come check out our Discord and give it a shot.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for having a conversation with me today, Connor.
Yeah, thank you, Brock.